Discussion that's been had by some people in the independence movement, but not quite enough really, has been what will an independent Alberta look like? What's Alberta going to look like the day after full independence? Not even necessarily the day after the vote to go, but when this new nation is formed. And some of that means a lot of people have discussed it a lot, but we need to discuss it more. Right now, things are kind of hanging up because we're waiting on the courts for the question and the petitioning and then the actual referendum. And this is kind of an ideal time to really start digging into then, what is the constitution of this new nation going to look like? And a person who's done fantastic work on it already and built a bit of a framework is Professor Bruce Pardy. He was on my show the other week with the Western Standard Show. And on C2C Journal, it's the letter C, number 2, letter C. I'll put a link in the description to get to it. He did a long article, a great one, which is called, simply entitled, What the Constitution of an Independent Alberta Should Look Like. And he's got 13 elements in it. And again, I encourage you to click the link in the description to give it a full read. I'm not going to go through the entire, I'll go through the article in summary, but I won't read the entire thing because it'll take quite a while. But one of the, before I get into it, when Bruce was on my show, the main thing we agreed on right off the bat was we've got to make sure that an independent Alberta doesn't look anything like what we just came out of. A lot of people keep the mindset, opponents to independence too, or pointing out things of problems, challenges, under this assumption that we would maintain the Westminster parliamentary system in a new independent West or Alberta. Well, that would be stupid indeed, because we're just leaving one broken system to form another. We're taking on the same aspects that we're trying to escape, which would, we'd have a smaller unit of the same problem. So we need to think well outside the box and, change our mindset on what we think a constitution should look like. And what Bruce talked about, he talks about that in his article, is flipping over the perspective. The bottom line is the rights of the individual are paramount. And, the small amount of authority that the state should have should be the minimal amount. And we're granting the authority of the state. They're not granting freedoms to us. Because we look at it in the sense that the state sort of has all authority, and we have to try and carve our own exceptions for individual rights. Mr. Pardy could put it better. And again, going into more of the philosophical, the more difficult. A minimalist state. He talks about, if we got some people who are purist libertarians think we should have just anarchy and let things go. Well, that will end up with, we know, with human nature and so on, eventually just a number of warlords, a feudal system, a lot of violence, and some pretty unsavory people are just going to end up dominating, controlling things. Though we do it in a slow but certain way and call it democracy the way we do it now. But the number one part he talks about, this one's a little hard. We got to think around. Number one, force and threat of force is prohibited, because that's the main role of the state, is to keep it from your neighbor can come over and steal what you've worked for, your property, because perhaps they're stronger or have a bigger gun or whatever. And the threats of force, it can be just as bad. But then how does the state do that without imposing force or threats of force upon you or your neighbor? It's difficult. Because yes, this wants to make sure that in the first rule, it says no one, including the state, shall impose force or threats of force against the person or property of any citizen without consent. And then notwithstanding, proportional force or threats of force may be used to repel imminent force in self-defense to defend others or to protect property. In other words, you got to make a little bit of an exception for the state to be able to use that force to enforce the rules against force against you. Tough. It is. And it means you have to have some degree of a judiciary. You have to have a set of laws. You have to have enforcement. But you have to have a process to make sure. And the principle behind the process is always, again, defaulting to the right of the individual. And he goes into a lot more in-depth description of consent, use of force, and things like that. He talks about, what can't you do? Well, you can't strike others or touch them without their consent. You can't take their things. You can't trespass on their land. You can't produce smoke or pollution that interferes with the use of their land. See, there's where the sticky area of law gets, right? We talk about, oh, just trespassing and everything else, but you never thought to write into it, well, what about if the neighbor's burning noxious things and polluting my air over here? And that's where we get into courts and some of the challenges with it. They're unavoidable, but we want to limit them as much as possible. And we don't want prescriptive laws that have to cover each and every little tiny thing, because that's where the bureaucrats and the lawyers and the rest end up just bringing things into a mire. Number 4, citizens are subject to no other laws. So yeah, citizens shall be subject to no laws governing their conduct except as expressly set out in the Constitution. Right off the bat, make it small, make it relatively simple, so that you don't end up with, a stack of laws, a library full of laws, and again, people who really don't have any true freedoms because of that, because of the bureaucracy around it, because of the lawyers around it. I don't know if I mentioned at the start, Bruce Pardy, who wrote all this, is a professor of law at Queen's University. So yeah, he's familiar with the depth of the law and everything. Number 5, again, getting back to that, flipping the default, and it gets more into that philosophical discussion. We now have a state. That may be necessary, he says, but it's also a problem. The state needs to be powerful enough to keep the peace, but not powerful enough to threaten the freedom of the people. And he writes much more on that and on how to try and reduce the amount of influence the state has. He talks about it, and this is a great statement, on this. He says, the list isn't exhaustive, of the things that the state can't or shouldn't do, because it says the Constitution doesn't enumerate restrictions. When the state's without powers, the numbers of things it can't do is infinite. You see, that's what he's talking about, flipping it over. If it's basically not expressed in there, those are things that the state can't do. Simple as that. You can't. Stay out of it. It's not your business. We will sort that out otherwise. Now, this is an interesting one, number 6, term limits. And he's talking about amateur public servants. So he's not even just talking about term limits for politicians and elected roles. He talks about, tenured judges, untouchable bureaucrats, petty functionaries. Those areas in the bureaucracy need to be cut and shouldn't be permanent positions of authority and power. We're talking about, what's referred to often as the deep state. Putting term limits on that. And that comes with challenges, good and bad. I mean, sometimes a tenured person, eventually builds a lot of experience, but that's assuming they always have the public good in mind. And often, unfortunately, they don't, or eventually they lose that instinct. So it's a challenging area. Like, I'm not agreeing with 100% of what Mr. Pardy puts out, but he puts out a great framework to begin with. And let's start talking about this then. I don't know if this is feasible. I don't know. Let's discuss it some more. This is an interesting one. No one should serve in the Alberta Armed Forces, Alberta Police Force, or a combination for longer than a cumulative total of 15 years over their lifetime. This is how you stop getting high military authorities going on, or paramilitary if we're talking police. But he says, by removing the incentives to become a public servant for any reason other than public service. So he talks about it. They should be remunerated an amount equivalent to the national median wage. None should receive pensions, bonuses, or any other kind of remuneration for their service. That gets back to, pensions. Yeah, people, well, how can you have somebody work without a pension? Well, is a pension the responsibility of the state? Can these things not be set up outside of that? Again, voluntarily. It's a bigger discussion, but we have to think differently than we've been trained to. We've been trained to think the state's responsible for everything. If we want this new state, we have to rethink how that state's going to act and what it's responsible for. Now, this is one I really like, branches of the state and elections. So he's talking about a bicameral state, and this is something I've talked about before too. I'd like to see 2 houses, and he's using examples like the American one, a House of Representatives and a Senate. Each will have 1 vote in their house and in the Senate, and laws must be passed by both. Now, the House of Representatives would be represented by population. 87 ridings, fine, broken up by population. Similar amount as what we've got in the legislature now. Same amount, actually. And then 1 representative from each riding elected every 3rd year by the citizens. So lowering the amount between elections. Hey, elections aren't that hard, guys. Citizens over the age of 18 have the 1 vote. And the Senate, now this is where we get down to regional representation. and representation by territory. So say 50 Senate districts, roughly of equal physical size, not by population, one senator from each district elected every third year. And this really forces legislative compromise. This keeps Calgary and Edmonton from dominating the rural areas of Alberta. Because, again, if we go the same way into a similar system to what we just left, we're just going to have a smaller version. We need to have smaller areas of governance represented. And likewise, the rural areas take it up and dominate the urban, because it wouldn't get things through the House of Representatives. Not perfect, nothing is. But it would force them to think of both sides of that before you try to do anything in there. He talks about whether, an executive being a president and vice president and things such as that. The Alberta Judiciary, this is interesting, even limits the amount of judges and where they would sit. One court should consist of an Alberta appeals court with one judge for every 100,000 citizens, and a trial court with one judge for every 10,000 citizens. No other Alberta courts shall exist. Interesting. And then it talks about the breakdown in the regions and where the courts and judges will come from. I'm not going to go through all of it. He has another good statement. He says, constitutions have Achilles' heel. They're written in words. Words have ambiguities, and then courts interpret what the words mean. That's when we start getting these activist judges. This is when we start getting clear as day treaties that were written, signed, contracts 140 years ago. Now we get judges reinterpreting the words and adding all of these, reading in all of these different things that really were well beyond the spirit of what those treaties were. Likewise with other laws and things such as that. So that gets into whether you want a law and a system based on precedent, which really empowers judges, or not. Again, I would encourage you to read the whole thing, because that gets a lot more in depth, and it's going to be a long video if I cover it all. But he really digs into that. This is one where, in the next one, number 9, where you see I wonder about the feasibility or whatnot, but it's interesting to talk about because people have concerns with it. Is only human beings are legal persons, and that's talking about corporations, because corporations were formed as a means for much larger encompassing business. But how can you do that larger business if you can't borrow and acquire credit? Well, how do you acquire credit? Well, you have to have property to secure it. Well, a corporation, if it's not a person, how can it own property? How can it sign a contract? I'd like to talk to Bruce more about this, because I understand the problem of these literal, soulless institutions having almost the same rights as humans. But at the same time, for large business, and we do need large business, guys, we need cross-border business, we need these sorts of things, but we can't make them people either. They got to be able to be sued and sue others. They've got to be able to hold property. It's a bigger discussion, but out of control corporations can certainly impact our lives almost as much as out of control governments. So how do we rein them in without ruining our business environment? Anyway, his constitutional proposal there has some simple statements saying only human beings are legal persons. Fair enough. And no other entities have legal status to own property, make contracts, have a standing in a court, or do any other thing. I don't know about that one. I honestly don't. I'd like to talk to Bruce more about it, because also, how do we deal with existing? But maybe it's me having to think outside of that box I've been trained to so far, right? These are the discussions we have to have. Here's another area where I have a bit of difference with Bruce. He talks number 10, citizenship. And a lot of people, I think, would agree with this, particularly because we're suffering so much of the ill effects of mass immigration right now. And he's pointing out Western countries have low birth rates. Citizens aren't procreating fast enough to replace their aging populations. And that's true. And the low birth rate has served as one of the main rationales for rampant immigration. Governments are flooding their own countries with newcomers so fast in such numbers that their cultures are now in doubt. All of that's pretty much true, except one of the things that happens, and we've seen that around the world too, is it's prosperous countries where the birth rate gets lower. Families often, a lot of people choose, and again, maybe that takes a cultural shift or whatnot, but people choose to only have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 children. I know a lot of people have huge families, and great, But a lot of people in the richer countries just choose to have a couple or a few because they can. And they focus on that and they have them and they enjoy and they live their life. In poor countries, you have to have a lot of children for a number of reasons. It's part of your own security for pension in a sense. If there's not a good pension plan, you rely on your kids taking care of you later in life. Also, if you have poorer countries with more infant mortality rates and so on, you want to have a number of children to make sure a number survive to adulthood. Another part is in less prosperous countries, birth control might not be as readily available. Education may not be as high, so they don't realize the birth control options. Lots of things. But the bottom line is wealthier countries tend to breed less. It's not just a cultural thing. So how do we deal with that? If we do have population decline, which may continue to happen, I think it will happen under this model, how do we deal with that? Or is that okay? Maybe having a shrinking population is all right. I believe he feels it would grow as people change their perspective. Perhaps it would. Separation of powers, number 11. Different parts of the states do different jobs. The legislature, the executive, the judiciary. And yeah, that's a big hornet's nest. That's where the lawyers and everybody really get in there when we're talking about who's got jurisdiction where and whatnot. So this talks about and keeps it simple in saying it shall not delegate substantive lawmaking, adjudicative authority, or any part of the executive to any other person. Because that's that slippery slope you get down, and you suddenly get all these different authorities, and the bureaucracy eats you up. Crown land and other transitions. This one's neat. This is a big discussion. And he gives a few theoretical examples more rather than some solid things, because it's difficult to figure out how to deal with that. I mean, most of the land in Alberta is technically owned by the provincial crown, but we don't want the state owning most of the land. But how do you then divide that up among citizens? He talks about, a lottery maybe. Well, that wouldn't really be fair. Somebody gets a chunk of low-value bushland in the deep north, and somebody wins a chunk of good oil land in central Alberta, or some nice tourist mountain land or something like that. So he's got to find a way to grant citizens beneficial interest, so where every citizen does own that land, but how you do it. And he proposes a few different solutions to that. Excuse me. Talking about distributing to citizens a parcel of comparable market value, rather than say, that's what I was talking about, a chunk of muskeg in the north versus a piece of prime tourist or housing property, but then dividing that up and figuring out what comparable market value is. Boy, that could be a big process, but hey, whoever said it was going to be easy, right? So he talked about, how independence would require transition on other fronts. Who qualifies as the first citizens in a new country? Yeah, that was one of the things actually earlier that I kind of glossed over. I shouldn't have skipped. That's where I talk about. I disagree with Bruce a bit, because he was talking about the only citizens will be those who were born here, or at least parented by one citizen of this country to begin with, or not. I understand, again, the need to control the mass immigration, but there could be too high a consequence of throttling the ability for others to come in and become citizens. I don't know. We've got to talk about it more. People talk about Japan. They very strongly limit who can come in and so on. And Japan has a lot of things that are doing fantastic over there versus what's going on in Western countries. At the same time, Japan also has an incredibly massive public debt. So there's no perfect situation by all means. And of course, one of the other transition things, how shall current First Nations reserved lands be divided into lots and title granted to individual members of the bands, which I think is the only way out of it eventually. It has to be. And then amendment, in number 13, and there's the difficult one, right? He says to protect the Constitution, but also preserve democratic self-determination. Amendments should be difficult, but not impossible. And he gives a 2/3 method along with referendum by citizens to amend the Constitution. So that's doable, and but not easy. Getting 2/3 of the citizens to get up and vote, it means it better be something important. So, in Canada currently, the bottom line is the Constitution is almost impossible to amend. Not almost, it is. So that's where we're kind of stuck in this quagmire. So in his conclusion, he says the Constitution is not complete. Gaps remain, but these 13 elements are the bones and create an architecture for a free country. I just think it's great. It's great that he laid it out. And I know some other individuals who've built constitutions, written them. They've published them. They posted in places. They've emailed them to me. And lots have great ideas and different aspects. I can't read them all on here, but Bruce's is just well broken down. It's available online. Check it out and start having these talks. Do you agree with everything in it? There's some different parts you disagree with. And let's start fleshing it out, because one of the difficulties that's going to come when referendum time comes are people asking at the door and say, I might want out of this current system, but I'm not sure what you want to bring me into. You got to know what you're moving towards, not just what you're moving out of. And having a draft, at the very least, constitution is going to be essential for that. And if you're proposing the same thing as what you just left, then you're pissing in the wind. You're wasting time. So give it a read. Check it out. Also check out the Sovereigntist Handbook. I don't write so much on what we need for a constitution, but I talk about how to get there. And we're going to get there.